Yeah, I was just asking you to tell us about Cohen a little bit and the context of his work as it relates to yours, and then this question specifically about his point about it being the most fraudulent scandal.
So Stephen F. Cohen, who passed away in September at the age of 81, he was just an eminent Russia scholar. He was professor emeritus at NYU and Princeton. He briefed the first President Bush at the end of the Cold War. He was an expert on CBS News talking about, U.S.-Russia relations. He was, this one of these eminent figures in the academy who was widely cited and who actually really shaped the field of Russian studies, and especially in the Soviet era, where he wrote a book that really changed people's understanding of the nature of the Soviet system. And he pointed out that there were alternatives to Stalinism that were crushed. And he wrote a number of books that were just very influential. But around 2014, he became a black sheep, and he became vigorously attacked. And all of a sudden, kind of his detractors did their best to push him out of the respectable circles, because when the U.S. helped organize a coup in Ukraine on Russia's doorstep, Cohen pointed out that Russia was responding rationally when it, retook Crimea, which was initially given to Ukraine by the Soviet Union. Russian forces did not invade Crimea. They were already there. And Vladimir Putin, I think, understandably was afraid that, with the coup mongers in Ukraine talking about joining NATO, which was a pretty obvious U.S. goal at the time, that they didn't want to see lose a military port right on their doorstep to a potentially new NATO country. And so, Cohen would just point out that Russia was reacting rationally to a coup that the U.S. had helped promote. So Victoria Nuland, who recently got appointed to serve under Joe Biden, she was going over with Senator Chris Murphy and John McCain, and they were handing out cookies and encouraging protesters in Maidan Square who were trying to overthrow the government. And there was some genuine concern about corruption, because the government that they were protesting Ukraine was corrupt. But it wasn't just that. There also was this far right element that doesn't want to see Ukraine have any kind of friendly ties to Russia, and doesn't want to recognize the existence of millions of people in Ukraine who speak Russian and who ethnically identify with Russia. Ukraine is a very split country. There are people with ancestral ties to Russia, and people who come from the far right who loathe Russia and want to kind of purge Ukraine of any kind of Russian identity. So we took the side, the U.S. took the side of the far right anti-Russian fascists, basically, and that's who we installed in government. And because Stephen F. Cohen opposed that, and then when Russia intervened in Syria, because in the words of Secretary of State John Kerry, Russia didn't want to see an ISIS government because the U.S. was watching by. This is what Kerry said in a leaked phone call. There's audio. The U.S. was basically watching ISIS encroach on Damascus. And the U.S. hope was that that would put Assad in such a weak position that he would negotiate his way out of power, while meanwhile the U.S. was spending billions of dollars to fund and arm other jihadist groups fighting Assad in Syria. So Russia intervened to put a stop to that because they didn't want to see an ISIS government. And then the demonization of Russia really, really ramped up even more. And Cohen again pushed back against that. And for that, he was even pushed out of progressive circles as well. So he used to be a regular guest on Democracy Now! And actually that's where I met him, because I worked there for 10 years. But once he started calling that out, he wasn't welcome there anymore either. And this was just a part of a general trend in progressive circles, unfortunately, that really accepted credulously so much of the propaganda that has been used to wage this new Cold War that Stephen F. Cohen was challenging. So it was interesting these last few years to see this guy who was, so influential in the academy getting attacked, not just by, people in the mainstream called a Putin apologist. There were hit pieces on him written in the Daily Beast and other outlets, but even in progressive circles as well. But the guy was principled, and he wasn't threatened by all these attacks. As he said to me, he's like, I'm old, I have good health care, so what do I care? And so he but he infuriated all these people because he was sticking to the facts and his principles. And so for that, people tried to really demonize him. So in the last few years, I had many opportunities to interview him because there was so much to respond to. And it was just strange that as part of this rightward drift, even inside liberal progressive spaces, there wasn't that much room left for him. And that's why he was just so appreciated by people who followed his work, because A, he was such a good scholar and his books are so important, but he also he had rare courage and principle, and he was just masterful in how he delivered the facts. So in terms of Russiagate, he also very early on called that out for what it was. He pointed out the lack of evidence. And he also pointed out that, look, even if everything that is that Russia was accused of was correct, that the hyperbole and the mania about it was so ridiculous. So look, the collusion thing, we know that to be now baseless. But look, there's still are these allegations that Russia was destroying our democracy because they allegedly stole some emails from the Democrats, and this Russian troll farm put up some dumb social media ads on Facebook and Instagram and Twitter. And, Cohen was pointing out, like, people are comparing this to Pearl Harbor and wanting us to retaliate against Russia. And have they lost their minds? And when you look at the actual facts of these allegations themselves, I'm personally skeptical that Russia even stole the emails. And you look at the social media posts, it's clear that had nothing to do with the Russian government, or at least there's no evidence that had anything to do with the Russian government. But look, even if it was all true, even if the Kremlin did all of this, the fact that we're going to compare stealing emails and social media posts to Pearl Harbor and 9/11, I mean, it's insane. And again, it goes back to what I talked about before. It has nothing to do with a genuine concern. It has to do with the interest that these allegations serve. They deflect from the fact that Democrats lost to a clown, Donald Trump. They deflect from having to look at the real problems that gave rise to Donald Trump and the real problems with this system. And they also encourage a demonization of Russia that ultimately is good for imperialism. It's good for weapons manufacturers, but it's bad for everybody else. And what is amazing to me is how many progressives and liberals got duped by this. So you have liberals saying the stupidest things I've ever heard them say. So Hillary Clinton literally said over and over and over that the reason Black people didn't vote for her in Michigan was because of Russian social media ads, right? Which is not just stupid, it's also straight up racist. Because how much racist contempt are you showing for Black voters in Michigan to say that the reason they didn't vote for Hillary is because they got duped by some dumb Russian social media ads? So you have this like open display of not just stupidity, but outright racist contempt for Black voters, in the Midwest, and they said this in Wisconsin as well. Every time there would be a study coming out about like Russian social media ads in the election, then you'd have people like David Axelrod saying, minority turnout did decline under, from Obama to Clinton. And you have to wonder, although we can't say for sure, you have to wonder if Russian social media ads was the deciding factor here. You look at, there's been this whole industry of studies funded to basically make this argument. And you have, New York Times articles about this. I mean, just Google, Black voters and Russian social media ads, and you'll see all these headlines about how it was Russians that convinced Black people not to vote for Saint Hillary. It's like, it's just insane. But then look at how many progressives and liberals went along with it, not seeing the obvious stupidity and racism. And so, the most interesting part to me of Russiagate is what it says about our liberal culture and how out of touch it is, and the lengths that it will go to avoid any honest self-reflection that threatens its own privilege and power.